Welcome. Today, we're diving deep into the brain's language centers. Think of this as your personal anatomical masterclass. We're going to build a really solid, exam-focused foundation in the neuroanatomy of language, piece by piece.
So, here's our roadmap for this journey. First, we'll cover the basics of the core language centers. Then, we're going to pinpoint their exact anatomy. After that, we'll trace the entire auditory pathway from ear to brain, see how the language circuits actually work in real time, and then we'll explore the clinical side of things with aphasia. And finally, we'll clear up some common confusion around conditions like dysarthria and auditory agnosia. All right, let's jump right in with Section 1 and lay down the essential concepts of how and where your brain processes language. So, when we talk about language from a neurological point of view, what are we really talking about? Well, it's this incredibly complex function that includes everything from reading and writing to speaking, and of course, understanding words. To pull all of this off, the brain uses a few core functional areas, which we're about to get into right now. Okay, let's meet the key players on the team. First up, we have Wernicke's area. Its big job is to let us recognize language, whether it's spoken or written, and then to create the initial plan for what we want to say. It's kind of like the comprehension and planning department. Working closely with it is the angular gyrus, which has a very specific role. It takes written text and numbers and processes them into a form our brain can get ready to speak. And then we have Broca's area. This is the production center. It generates the super detailed motor program for all our speech muscles, larynx, tongue, cheeks, lips, and then it shoots that program over to the primary motor cortex to actually make it happen.
Now, this diagram is fascinating because it shows us something called hemispheric dominance. For most of us, language is heavily concentrated on one side of the brain. The left hemisphere, which you see here labeled the categorical hemisphere, is the powerhouse for language, speech, writing, and calculation. The right side, the representational hemisphere, is more focused on things like spatial visualization and analysis. And what this diagram also shows so well is that sensory info is processed contralaterally. That just means information from your right eye or right ear goes to your left hemisphere, and the other way around. So just how dominant is that left hemisphere for language? Well, the numbers are pretty staggering. For right-handed people, a whopping 95% process language mainly in the left hemisphere. And even for left-handed folks, it's still the clear majority at 60%. So the big takeaway here is that no matter which hand you write with, for most people, the left side of the brain is running the language show. Okay, let's move into our second section. Now we're going to get really specific, pinpointing the anatomical addresses of these centers and looking at the neural toolkit, the cranial nerves that make all of this possible. These two images are going to help us get our bearings. Over on the left, you've got the brain mapped out into what are called Brodmann areas. They're just regions defined by their unique cell structure. On the right, you have a more traditional anatomical view, and you can see Broca's area right up front in the frontal lobe. Wernicke's area is further back, where the temporal and parietal lobes meet. And the angular gyrus is tucked right behind Wernicke's. Now, let's get even more precise. Listen, for any exam, these are the details you've got to know. First up, Broca's area. Its precise address is the pars triangularis of the inferior frontal gyrus, and that corresponds to Brodmann areas 44 and 45. Next, Wernicke's area. You'll find it wrapped around the auditory cortex on the sylvian fissure, right at that junction of the temporal and parietal lobes. That's Brodmann area 22. And finally, the angular gyrus. It's located in the inferior parietal lobule, which makes total sense, given its job of mixing together tactile, auditory, and visual info. This guy is Brodmann area 39. Now, because talking is a voluntary action, it's all part of the pyramidal system, and it needs a whole team of cranial nerves to work. Let's run through them. First, you've got cranial nerve V, the trigeminal, which controls your chewing muscles. Then CN7, the facial nerve, handles your facial expressions. CN8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, is pure sensory. It brings in all the sound information. Next, there's a group for the throat. CN9, the glossopharyngeal, and CN10, the vagus, which both help move the pharynx. The vagus also controls the larynx. Then there's CN11, the spinal accessory, which controls neck muscles to help position the larynx. And finally, CN12, the hypoglossal nerve, gives us all that fine motor control over the tongue. You need all 7 of them working together for clear speech. All right, we know where everything is located. Now, let's follow the journey of sound itself. In this next section, we are going to trace the entire pathway from the second a signal hits the ear all the way until it lands in the brain's auditory cortex. Okay, this diagram is our master map for the auditory pathway. I know it looks a little complicated at first glance, but don't worry, we're going to break it down step by step, following that signal from the cochlea up through the brainstem and thalamus to its final stop in the cortex.
Okay, let's trace this signal together nice and slow. Step 1. The signal starts in the cochlear nerve, which is part of cranial nerve VI. Step 2. It hits its first relay station in the brainstem at the ventral and dorsal cochlear nuclei. And what's really important here is that fibers from both of these nuclei decussate. That just means they cross over to the other side. Step 3. Fibers from the ventral nucleus shoot over to the superior olivary nucleus. Its specific job is to figure out the direction a sound is coming from. Step 4, now we have the lateral lemniscus, which is the main highway heading up. Fibers from the dorsal nucleus jump on here, and they're all about processing the quality of the sound. Step 5, the next big stop is the inferior colliculus in the midbrain. Step 6, from there, the signal goes to the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. This is the last relay point before the cortex. And finally, step 7, the signal arrives at its destination, the primary auditory cortex, traveling along the auditory radiations.
So, we've gotten the raw sound data up to the cortex. But now what? How does the brain actually use that information to understand and create language? In Section 4, we're going to move from that raw sensory pathway to the high-level processing circuits to see how it all comes together. Let's start with a classic example, the circuit for hearing a word and then repeating it. Okay, step 1. The sound signal lands in the primary auditory cortex, which is Brodmann area 41. Step 2. That raw sound data gets passed over to Wernicke's area, which does the heavy lifting of interpreting what the words actually mean. Step 3. The plan of what to say is then sent from Wernicke's over to Broca's area, traveling along a fiber bundle called the arcuate fasciculus. Step 4. Broca's area gets fired up and creates the detailed motor plan for saying the words. And finally, step 5. That plan is sent to the motor cortex, which gives the final command to the speech muscles. Now, before we tackle our next circuit, we have to get two super important terms straight in our heads. A grapheme is simply a written symbol that stands for a sound, like the letter T. A phoneme, on the other hand, is the actual smallest unit of sound in a word, like the T sound you make with your mouth. This difference is everything when it comes to understanding how we read. And this right here shows the much more complicated pathway for reading a word out loud. The whole point of this circuit is to turn visual graphemes, the letters you see, into auditory phonemes, the sounds you speak. And here's a cool little side note. This process can actually boost your memory. Actually saying words out loud creates a stronger memory trace. It's a phenomenon called the production effect. Let's walk through these 8 steps together. Step 1. Your eyes see the word, and that visual info travels on the retinogeniculate tracts to the thalamus. Step 2, the signal continues along the geniculocalcarine tract to the visual cortex. Step 3, now in the visual association cortex, area 19, something called orthographic processing happens. Basically, your brain recognizes the shapes as a string of letters. Step 4, that info crosses over to the dominant hemisphere through the splenium of the corpus callosum. Now for the magic. Step 5. The visual picture of the word gets passed to the angular gyrus, area 39, for the all-important grapheme to phoneme conversion. Step 6. It's then sent to Wernicke's area, area 22, so you can understand what the word means. Step 7. This info, which is now basically auditory, zips along the arcuate fasciculus to Broca's area, area 45, to create the speech pattern. And finally, step 8. That pattern goes to the primary motor cortex to tell your muscles how to say the word. Okay, now that we've built this incredibly detailed picture of how language is supposed to work, it's time to see what happens when these delicate circuits are damaged. Let's move into Section 5 and talk about aphasia. So, what is aphasia? It's an acquired communication disorder. That means it can mess with any and all parts of language: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. But, and this is absolutely the most important thing to remember, aphasia does not affect a person's intelligence. It's a communication problem, not an intelligence problem. By far, the most common cause is a stroke, usually from ischemia when the middle cerebral artery, or MCA, gets blocked. Of course, other things like head injuries, brain tumors, infections, or dementia can also cause it. And this slide right here shows you exactly why a stroke in the MCA is so devastating for language. You can see how the middle cerebral artery and all its branches are the primary blood supply for almost all the key language areas we've been talking about. You can see its segments, M1 through M4, and its branches are responsible for feeding Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and the whole region around them. Okay, let's compare the two big types of aphasia. On one hand, you have Wernicke's aphasia. This is a fluent or receptive aphasia. The patient can speak fluently, with normal grammar and rhythm, but the words are often meaningless, like a word salad. Their comprehension is terrible, and critically, they often have anosognosia, meaning they don't even realize they have a problem. They also tend to have paraphasias, where they substitute words. On the other hand, you have Broca's aphasia. This is a non-fluent or expressive aphasia. Speech is slow, labored, and difficult. But their comprehension is mostly fine. And this means the patient is painfully aware of their problem, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly frustrating for them. There's a third major type you need to know, conduction aphasia. You can think of this as a disconnection syndrome. It's caused by damage to the arcuate fasciculus. That's the cable connecting Wernicke's and Broca's. So what does it look like? Well, patients can understand language just fine, and they can speak fluently. But the key deficit, the absolute hallmark of this condition, is that they have terrible speech repetition. They just can't repeat words or sentences they just heard. You might also see something called conduit d'approche, where they make these repetitive, self-correcting attempts to get a word out. All right, for our final section, we're going to clear up some common clinical confusion. We're going to talk about two other disorders, dysarthria and auditory agnosia, that are related to what we've been discussing, but are very different from aphasia. Nailing these distinctions is key. First, let's draw a really clear line in the sand between aphasia and dysarthria. Aphasia is a language disorder. The problem is in the brain's processing centers. It's about finding or forming words. Dysarthria, on the other hand, is a motor speech disorder. The problem isn't the language itself. It's impaired control of the muscles you use to talk. The brain knows the word, but the mouth can't produce it clearly. This diagram shows us what's going on in dysarthria. The issue can be damage to the upper motor neurons, which are in the motor cortex up in the CNS, or it could be damage to the lower motor neurons, down in the pons and medulla in the PNS. Either way, you're disrupting the signal getting to the speech muscles. Now, here's an important clinical point. Many of these muscles get nerve signals from both sides of the brain, so if there's only a unilateral disruption, the dysarthria might be pretty mild or temporary. It's when you have bilateral disruption that you get more severe, lasting problems. And finally, let's define auditory agnosia. This is a really interesting one. It's the inability to recognize or tell the difference between sounds, even though the person's hearing is perfectly fine. It's caused by damage to the auditory association areas. And here is the key distinction you absolutely have to grasp. Their speech comprehension is shot because they can't recognize the sounds of the words being spoken, but their other language skills, reading, writing, and even speaking their own thoughts, are still there. And that brings us to our final question, a little thought experiment to tie everything we've learned together. Imagine this. A patient can write a perfect sentence, showing that their ability to formulate language is intact, but they cannot understand that exact same sentence when you speak it to them. What's the most likely diagnosis? See, this scenario really forces you to tease apart the difference between a language processing failure and a sound recognition failure, making you apply the very specific details we've covered in this masterclass.